Picking up with Livy's History of Rome, Livy on Hannibal, Book 25, Part 23. At precisely the time that Capua was being encircled with siege works, the assault on Syracuse came to an end. This was achieved by the aggressiveness and courage of the general and his army, but it was facilitated, too, by internal treachery. At the start of the spring, Marcellus had been unsure whether to redirect the war effort towards Hamilco and Hippocrates in Agrigentum, or to intensify the siege of Syracuse. He could see that taking the city by assault was impossible, since its topography made it impregnable, both by land and sea, and alimented by supplies arriving almost freely from Carthage, she could not be starved into submission. But he could leave no avenue unexplored. There were amongst the Romans some prominent Syracusan nobles who had been driven out at the time of the break with Rome for disagreeing with the new policy. Marcellus instructed these refugees to meet and probe the sympathies of the men of their party in the city, and to assure them that they would have their freedom and live under their own constitution if Syracuse were delivered to the Romans. No opportunity of arranging a meeting materialized. The loyalty of many people was suspect, and this had made everybody wary, and put them on guard against such activities taking place undetected. But then one slave belonging to the exiles was accepted in the city, posing as a deserter, and he met a handful of people and initiated discussions on the subject. Subsequently, a number of men were transported around to the Roman camp, concealed under some nets in a fishing boat, and they held discussions with the refugees. The same men repeated the procedure on a number of occasions, and were joined by others and others again, until their total number eventually reached 80. Then, just when preparations for the betrayal were complete, the plot was betrayed by Epicides, by a certain Attalus, who was incensed at not having been made party to it, and all the conspirators were tortured to death. This hope had proved illusory, but another immediately arose in its place. A Spartan named Demopus had been sent to King Philip from Syracuse, and had been captured by some Roman ships. Epicides was anxious to ransom him at any price, and Marcellus did not object, because at that moment the Romans were courting the friendship of the Aetolians, with whom the Spartans were allied. The men sent to discuss the ransom thought that the most central location for their meeting, and the one most convenient for both parties, was at the Trogili port, close to the tower they called Galagura. I don't like that, no. Again, the men sent to discuss the ransom thought that the most central location for their meeting, and the one most convenient for both parties, was at the Trogili port, close to the tower they called Galligra. Their comings and goings to this spot became quite frequent, and in the course of them one of the Romans took a close look at the wall. By counting the stones, and judging for himself the dimensions of each of their faces, he calculated the wall's height as well as one could by guesswork. He decided that it was considerably lower than he and everyone else had earlier supposed, and that it could be scaled with even quite short ladders, and he reported this to Marcellus. The idea seemed one not to be rejected out of hand. However, access to the spot was impossible, since it was more carefully guarded for the very reason just mentioned, and they needed some window of opportunity. This a deserter provided when he reported that a 3-day festival of Diana, which being held in town, and that, because of the shortage of other goods during the siege, the feasting involved more copious quantities of wine than usual. The wine had been supplied to all the people by Epicides, and distributed amongst the tribes by the leading citizens. When Marcellus received the news, he had a word with a few of his military tribunes. Through them, centurions and ordinary soldiers, who were up to taking on and braving the dangers of such a bold adventure, were singled out, and ladders were secretly prepared. Marcellus ordered the other men to be given the signal to take refreshment and rest in good time, as they had a night operation ahead of them. Then, when he felt the point had come at which people who had been feasting during the day would have had enough wine and would be falling asleep, he ordered the soldiers of a single maniple to take up the ladders, and about 1,000 armed men were led silently to the appropriate point in a narrow column. When the first men had scaled the wall noiselessly and calmly, the others followed them up in rows, for the daring of those ahead of them encouraged even the hesitant. 24. Then the 1,000 soldiers had taken possession of a section of the wall. The rest of the troops were brought forward, and they began to scale it with a greater number of ladders. They had already been given a signal from the hexapolon, which the advance party had reached after coming through a district that was thoroughly deserted, for most of the sentries had feasted in the towers, and had either fallen asleep over their cups or were still drinking in a semi-inebriated state. A few they surprised and killed in their beds. Near the hexapolon is a small gate. Work had begun on smashing this with extreme force. The agreed trumpet signal had been given from the hexapolon, and by this point the secret operation was everywhere turning into open violence. For they had reached Epipolae, which they found strongly guarded, and it was now a question of frightening the enemy rather than eluding them, and frightening them they did. As soon as the blasts of the trumpets were heard, and the shouting of the Romans, who were now in control of the walls and a section of the city, the sentinels thought the whole town was occupied and ran off. Some fled along the wall, others jumped from it, or were pushed off by the frenzied crowds. Most, however, were unaware of the cataclysmic event. They were all heavy with drink and sleep, and in a town of such vast dimensions, news of what was going on in one quarter did not become known to the whole. At dawn, after breaking into the hexapolon, Marcellus entered the city with all his troops, walking everybody and sending them all scurrying for their weapons to bring whatever help they could to their almost captured city. Epicides came at a quick march from the island, which the Syracusans themselves called the Nassos, quite certain that it was only a case of a few men having taken advantage of the sentinels' negligence to slip over the wall, and that he would soon drive them out. When he was confronted with people running in terror, he would tell them they were only increasing the panic, and that their reports were exaggerated and alarmist. But when he saw the whole area around Epipolae filled with armed men, he merely assailed his enemy with a few javelins, and then marched his column back to Acradina. He was, however, less afraid of the strength and superior numbers of his enemy than he was of the opportunity that might be given for internal treachery, which he thought could result in his finding the gates of Acradina, and the island closed to him in the upheaval. When Marcellus came over the fortifications and from the higher ground saw what was probably at the time the world's most beautiful city stretched out before his eyes, they say he shed tears partly from joy over the greatness of his achievement, but partly, too, because of the city's glories of old. He was reminded of the Athenian fleets that had been sunk there, of the two mighty armies that had been destroyed along with their leaders, of all the critical wars fought with the Carthaginians. He thought of all the city's wealthy tyrants and kings, and of Hiero above all, a king whose memory was still fresh, and who, a fact more important than everything that his courage and success had brought him, was remarkable for his services to Rome. All this came to mind, and it occurred to him that in the space of an hour it would all be ablaze and reduced to ashes. Before advancing his troops to Acradina, he sent ahead some Syracusans who, as was noted above, were serving with the Roman troops to see if they could, with conciliatory language, induce the enemy to surrender their city. 25. The gates and walls of Acradina were for the most part held by deserters, who, having no hope of pardon under terms of surrender, permitted no one to approach the walls or to parley. After the failure of this approach, Marcellus ordered a retreat to the Euryalus. This is a hill on the outskirts of the city, away from the sea, overlooking the road leading into the countryside and to the interior of the island, and therefore very conveniently situated for receiving supplies. The man who had been put in command of this vantage point by Epicides was the Argive called Philodemus, and to him Sosis, one of the tyrant's assassins, was sent by Marcellus. The two had a long conversation in which Sosis was stalled by the other's evasive language, and he reported to Marcellus that Philodemus had taken time to reflect on the matter. Philodemus then proceeded to put things off from day to day, waiting for Hippocrates and Hamilco to move up their camp and their legions. For he was certain that, if he took these into his stronghold, the Roman army could be boxed in within the city walls and destroyed. Marcellus saw no possibility of the Marcellus saw no possibility of the Euryalus being either surrendered or captured, and he established a camp between Neapolis and Tycha. These are the names of areas in the city which are themselves the size of cities, for he feared that, if he entered heavily populated districts, his plunder-hungry men simply would not be held in check. Spokesmen from Tycha and Neapolis came to him there wearing woolen fillets and carrying suppliant branches, and begged him to refrain from slaughter and burning. Marcellus held a meeting to discuss what constituted entreaties rather than demands on their part, and with the agreement of all present he issued orders to the men that no one should do harm to any free person. All else, he said, would be regarded as booty. The camp was enclosed by a series of interconnected house walls. Marcellus placed sentry posts and pickets at its gates, where they opened to the streets, to prevent an attack on the camp while the men were scattered in the town. He then gave the signal, and the soldiers ran hither and thither, smashing in doors and making the whole city ring with panic and confusion. But the bloodshed there was none. There was no need to the looting until the men had carried off There was no end to the looting until the men had carried off the whole mass of goods that years of prosperity had built up. In the meantime, Philodemus lost all hope of receiving assistance. He accepted a guarantee of a safe conduct to return to Epicides, led out his garrison, and surrendered the hill to the Romans. While everyone's attention was focused on the confusion in the captured section of the city, Balmacar seized on a night when a violent storm made it impossible for the Roman fleet to ride at anchor on the open sea, and left the harbor of Syracuse through unpatrolled waters. He headed out to sea with 35 ships, leaving 55 for Epicides and the Syracusans, and after giving the Carthaginians a full account of the critical situation in Syracuse, returned a few days later with a fleet of 100. He was rewarded by Epicides, it is said, with numerous gifts from Hiero's treasure. 26. After taking control of the Euryalus, Marcellus posted a garrison there, and thus freed himself of one particular concern. Now he need have no fear of an enemy force being taken into the citadel to his rear, and creating havoc amongst the troops who were enclosed within the confines of the city walls. He thereupon proceeded to blockade Acradina, establishing 3 camps of strategic points in the hope of bringing the enemy who were under siege there to the point of complete privation. The forward post of both sides had seen no action for a number of days when suddenly the arrival of Hippocrates and Hamilco actually put the Romans under attack on every side. Hippocrates established a fortified camp at the great harbor, and then giving a signal to the men who were occupying Acradina, he launched an assault on the old camp of the Romans, which was under Crispinus' command. Meanwhile, Epicides made a counterattack on the forward post of Marcellus, and the Punic fleet was landed on the shoreline between the city and the Roman camp in order to make it impossible for Crispinus to be sent assistance by Marcellus. Even so, the enemy produced more of a disturbance than a battle. Crispinus not only flung Hippocrates back from his fortifications, but even chased him as he fled in panic, and moreover, Marcellus forced Epicides back into the city. In fact, it seemed that enough had been done to ward off any danger in future from surprise attacks by the enemy. Both sides now faced the further problem of a plague, which was such as to easily distract attention from strategic planning for the war. It was autumn, and the area was naturally insalubrious, though much more so outside the city than within, and an unbearable heat severely affected the health of almost everybody in the 2 camps. At first, the instances of sickness and death were the result of the season and unhealthily locale. Later on, simply nursing the sick and physical contact with them spread the disease, so that those who fell ill died neglected and alone, or else they infected with the same violent disease those who visited their bedside and attended to their needs, and took them off to the grave with them. Funerals and death were every day before man's eyes, and cries of lamentation were to be heard everywhere, day and night. Eventually, familiarity with the affliction had so desensitized them that they not only ceased to hold processions for the dead, with tears and the appropriate cries of grief, but they did not even bear them out to the pyre and bury their remains. The result was that corpses lay strewn around before the eyes of people who were anticipating such a death themselves, and thanks to this fear, along with the rotting and noxious stench of the cadavers, the dead were wreaking havoc on the sick, and the sick on the healthy. Preferring death by the sword, a number charged along into the enemy outposts. The plague had attacked the Carthaginian camp much more fiercely than it had the Roman. However, since the Romans had, from their long blockade at Syracuse, become more habituated to the climate and the water, the Sicilians in the enemy army slipped away to their various cities nearby as soon as they saw the noxious environment, turning the disease into an epidemic, and, with nowhere to go themselves, the Carthaginians perished to a man, their generals, Hippocrates and Hamilco, with them. When the plague began to develop that level of intensity, Marcellus had brought his men into the city where shelter and shade had restored their weakening physical condition. Even so, many in the Roman army lost their lives to that same disease. 27. After the land force of the Carthaginians was wiped out, the Sicilians who had fought under Hippocrates had taken over. These are not large towns, but they are protected by their position and defenses. One of them is 3, the other 5, miles from Syracuse. To these towns they proceeded to bring provisions from their own communities, and they also sent out for military support. Meanwhile, Bomilcar once more set off for Carthage with his fleet. There he presented the situation of the Carthaginian allies in such a way as to raise hopes not only that these could be bought salutary assistance, but also that the Romans could be taken, along with the city which they had themselves virtually taken. Bomilcar thus induced the Carthaginians to send back with him as many cargo ships as they could, laden with supplies of all kinds, and also to increase the numbers in his fleet. So it was that he set off from Carthage with 130 warships and 700 freighters. He met with winds favorable enough for the crossing to Italy, but those same winds prevented him from rounding Pechenum. The news of Bomilcar's coming, and then of his unexpected delay, brought alternating joy and trepidation to Romans and Syracusans alike. Epicides was afraid that if the easterly winds, which were holding at the time, continued for several days, the Punic fleet would head back to Africa, and so he put Acrodina in the hands of the leaders of the mercenaries and sailed out to Bomilcar. Bomilcar had his fleet at anchor facing Africa and was dreading a naval engagement. It was not that he was no match for the enemy in strength or the number of his ships. In fact, he outnumbered them, but the winds favored the Roman fleet more than his. Even so, Epicides convinced him to risk a battle at sea, and when Marcellus saw a Sicilian army being drawn together from all over the island, and a Punic fleet also approaching with copious supplies, he too decided, despite being outnumbered in ships, to stop Bomilcar from approaching Syracuse. He feared that he might be under pressure in an enemy city, cut off by both land and sea. The two fleets faced off against each other around the promontory of Pechenum, ready to engage as soon as the sea was calm enough for them to make for the deep water. When the southeasterly wind, that had been at gale force for several days, subsided, Bomilcar made the first move. His fleet seemed at first to be heading out to deep water, simply to make it easier to sail around the promontory. But when he saw the Roman ships bearing down on him, he took off out to sea, though what caused his sudden panic is uncertain. He sent messengers to Heraclea to order the freighters to return to Africa, and he himself skirted the coast of Sicily and headed for Tarentum. Suddenly, robbed of his high hopes, Epicides sailed for Agrigentum, unwilling to return to a city that had been mostly captured and where he would be under siege. There he would now await the outcome rather than take any initiative. 28. When news now reached the Sicilian camp that Epicides had left Syracuse, and that the island had been abandoned by the Carthaginians and, for a second time, virtually delivered to the Romans, the Sicilians first held meetings to sound out the feelings of those under siege, and then sent spokesmen to Marcellus to negotiate terms for surrendering the city. There was very little disagreement between the parties on a settlement that would have the Romans take control of what had anywhere been under the tyrants, with the Sicilians keeping everything else along with their liberty and laws. Then, calling a meeting of the men who had been left in charge by Epicides, the spokesman told them that they had been sent by the Sicilian army on a joint mission to them and to Marcellus. The purpose of this was to ensure that those under siege and those who were not might all share the same fortunes, they said, and that one group could not negotiate a special deal for itself. The spokesmen were then welcomed into the city by them so they could speak with relatives and friends. They described to them the understanding they had already reached with Marcellus, and, by offering hope of safety, persuaded them to join them in an attack on Epicides' lieutenants, Polycletus, Philistio, and another Epicides, who had the surname Sindon. The three were murdered, and the citizen body was summoned to an assembly. Here the spokesmen deplored the food shortages and the other things that the inhabitants had often been complaining about in secret amongst themselves, but they added that, despite all these afflictions, the townspeople could not blame fortune, since it was for them to decide how long they were going to suffer them. What had caused the Romans to mount their attack on Syracuse had been their affection for the Syracusans, not hatred, they said. It was only when they heard of power being seized by Hippocrates and Epicides, who were lackeys of Hannibal and later of Hieronymus, that they had opened hostilities and proceeded to blockade the city, their intention being to crush not the city itself, but its cruel oppressors. Now, however, Hippocrates had been killed, Epicides had been cut off from Syracuse, and his officers killed. The Carthaginians had been repulsed on land and sea and deprived of any hold over Sicily. So what reason was there left for the Romans not to wish to see Syracuse out of harm's way, as much as if Hiero himself were still alive, that supreme promoter of friendship with Rome? And so, they concluded, the only danger facing the city and its inhabitants came from themselves, from their possibly letting slip the opportunity of settling matters with the Romans. And an opportunity such as they had at that very moment would never come again, if it appeared that Syracuse had been freed from a high-handed tyranny. 29. The speech received unanimous and enthusiastic support, but it was decided that praetors should be elected before representatives were chosen. Then spokesmen selected from the praetors were sent to Marcellus. Their leader spoke as follows. It was not we, the Syracusan people, who originally abandoned you, but Hieronymus, who was actually far less a blackguard in his dealings with you than he was with us. Later, too, when the peace was concluded at the time of the tyrant's assassination, it was no Syracusan who broke it, but the tyrant's lackeys, Hippocrates and Epicides, who used both intimidation and treachery to keep us in check. Nor can anyone say that we ever had a period of liberty that was not also a time of peace with you. At all events, the first thing we have now done, after gaining our independence by assassinating the men oppressing Syracuse, is to come to you to surrender our arms, to deliver to you our persons, our city, and our fortifications, and to refuse no conditions that might be imposed on us by you. Marcellus, the gods have bestowed on you the glory of capturing the most famous and beautiful city in the Greek world. all our memorable achievements on land and sea, those are added to the record of your triumph. Would you wish the greatness of the city you took as your prize to be entrusted only to word of mouth? Or would you prefer to have it on view for posterity, exhibiting to anyone arriving here, by land or sea, the trophies we won from the Athenians and Carthaginians, and those you have now won from us, and permitting you to pass on to your household, a Syracuse unscathed, to be kept under the patronage and protection of Marcellus' family? Do not let the memory of Hieronymus count more for you than the memory of Hiero. Hiero was your friend far longer than Hieronymus was your enemy. And while you have had tangible evidence of Hiero's benefactions, Hieronymus' madness served... Let's try that again. Do not let the memory of Hieronymus count more for you than the memory of Hiero. Hiero was your friend far longer than Hieronymus was your enemy, and while you have had tangible evidence of Hiero's benefactions, Hieronymus' madness served only to destroy him. As far as the Romans were concerned, all their requests could be granted and their safety assured. It was with the Sicilians themselves that the prospect of war and danger lay, for the deserters felt they were being surrendered to the Romans, and they saw to it that the mercenary auxiliary troops had the same fear. The mercenaries then seized their weapons and first of all killed the praetors, after which they scattered to massacre Sicilian citizens, murdering in their rage any that chance put in their way, and pillaging whatever came to hand. Then, not to be without leaders, they elected 6 prefects, 3 to take charge of Acradina, and 3 the Nassos. When the uproar finally died down, and the mercenaries made persistent inquiries into the arrangements made by the Romans, the truth of the matter began to become clear, namely, that their situation differed from that of the deserters. "30. The spokesman returned from Marcellus at a timely moment. They told the mercenaries that the suspicions that had inflamed them were groundless, and that the Romans had no reason to want to punish them. One of the 3 prefects of Arcadinia was a Spaniard called Mauricus, and a member of the Spanish auxiliary troops, was purposely sent to him as a member of the retinue attending the spokesman. This man took Mauricus aside and explained to him the conditions prevailing in Spain when he left. He had just come from there. Everything, he told him, was under armed occupation by Rome. Mauricus could be a leader of his people, he said, if he made some valuable contribution, whether he chose subsequently to serve with the Romans or go back to his country. If, on the other hand, he persevered with his choice of remaining under siege, he would be under blockade from land and sea, and what hope would he have then? Mauricus felt the force of these arguments. When the decision was made to send representatives to Marcellus, he had his brother included among them. The brother was brought to Marcellus, apart from the others, by the same Spanish auxiliary. After receiving a formal assurance from the commander, and arranging with him how the deed was to be done, he then went back to Acradina. At that point, to avert any suspicion on anyone's part that treachery was afoot, Mauricus declared that He was against the idea of envoys going back and forth. No one, he said, should be either received or sent out, and to tighten up security, appropriate areas should be separately assigned to the prefects, with each one responsible for the defense of his particular sector. Agreement was unanimous. When it came to parceling out the assignments, Mauricus himself received the area from the Arethusa fountain to the mouth the great harbor. To the mouth of the great harbor, and he made sure the Romans were aware of it. And so Marcellus gave orders for a transport ship, manned with troops, to be towed by quadrime to Acradina at night, and for the troops to disembark in the area of the gate near Arethusa fountain. This was done at the time of the 4th watch, and Mauricus, as had been agreed, took in through the gate the men who had been set ashore. At dawn, Marcellus launched a full-scale attack on the walls of Acradina. This had the effect not only of focusing on him the attention of the men holding Acradina, but also of making companies of armed men in the Nasus quit their post and come running to stem the furious Roman assault. In the melee, some skiffs, which had been made ready ahead of time and brought around to the Nasus, landed some armed men, who then made a surprise attack on the half-empty guard post and the gate, which was still open after the earlier exodus of troops. They took the Nasus, encountering little resistance, since it was abandoned by the guards who ran off in alarm. None put up a less effective opposition or showed less determination to remain at their post than the deserters. Having little trust even in their own side, they fled in the midst of the action. When Marcellus discovered that the Nasus had been taken, that one sector of Acradina was in his hands, and that Mauricus and his company had joined up with his men, he sounded the retreat. He wanted to prevent the pillaging of the royal treasures, which were rumored to be greater than they actually were. 31. The momentum of the Roman troops was thus checked, and the deserters in Acradina were given the time and opportunity to make good their escape. The Syracusans, finally relieved of their fare, opened the gates of Acradina and sent spokesmen to Marcellus requesting only that he spare their and their children's lives. Marcellus called a meeting, to which he also invited the Syracusan citizens who had been expelled from their homes during the civil unrest and had served with the Roman forces. Here, in response to the Syracusan request, he said that the good deeds of Hiero over 50 years did not outnumber the criminal acts committed against the Roman people during the past few by those in power in Syracuse. But he added, most of those acts had fittingly recoiled on their perpetrators and the guilty parties, and punished themselves for breaking the treaties more harshly than the Roman people would have wished. His blockade of Syracuse was now in its 3rd year, he said, and its aim was not to let the Roman people make the city-state its slave, but to prevent leaders of deserters from keeping it in captivity and oppression. An example of what the Syracusans could have done was provided by those citizens of Syracuse serving among the Roman troops, or by the Spanish leader, Mauricus, who surrendered his garrison, or finally by the courageous decision now taken by the Syracusans themselves, late though it was in coming. For himself, he said, Being able to capture Syracuse was quite insufficient as a reward for all the hardships and dangers on land and sea that over such a long period he had experienced around the Syracusan walls. A quaestor was then dispatched to the Nasus with a body of soldiers to take charge of the royal treasury and keep it under guard. The city was handed over to the common soldiers for looting, but guards were posted at the homes of those who had served with the Roman troops. There were many instances of atrocities committed from anger and from greed. Tradition has it that amidst the uproar, such as the fear reigning in a captured city might arouse, with soldiers running on the rampage everywhere, Archimedes was still concentrating intensely on some figures that he had drawn in the dust, and was killed by a soldier who did not know who he was. Marcellus, it is said, was upset by this. He made careful arrangements for his funeral, and also conducted a search for Archimedes' relatives, who then received honor and protection, thanks to the man's reputation and memory. Such, by and large, was the capture of Syracuse, and the quantity of booty taken was so great that more would hardly have been forthcoming if it were Carthage that had been captured, at a time when the war was being fought on equal terms. A few days prior to the capture of Syracuse, Titus Autosilius crossed from Lilybaeum to Utica with 80 quinqueremes. He entered the harbor of Utica before dawn and captured some transport ships with their cargoes of grain. He then disembarked and conducted raids on quite a large area around Utica, taking back to his ships all manner of plunder. He returned to Lilybaeum 2 days after setting sail from the town, and brought with him 130 freighters loaded with grain and booty. The grain he immediately dispatched to Syracuse, where, but for its timely arrival on the scene, conquerors and conquered alike were facing a deadly famine. 32. In Spain, there had been no significant development over the previous 2 years, and it had been a war of diplomatic maneuvering rather than armed conflict. But that summer the Roman commanders joined forces after leaving their winter quarters. A meeting was called, and opinions were unanimous on one point. Since their only achievement to date was to hold back Hasdrubal's advance into Italy, it was time for action to bring the war in Spain to an end. They believed that the 20,000 Celtiberians that had been raised over the winter were a sufficient addition to their strength to achieve this purpose. There were 3 enemy armies. Hasdrubal, son of Gisgo, and Mago had united their camps, and were about 5 days' march from the Romans. Closer to them was a veteran commander in the Spanish campaign, Hasdrubal, son of Hamilcar, who had his army near a city called Amtorges. It was Hasdrubal whom the Roman generals wanted to put out of action first, and they were confident that their forces were more than sufficient for the task. The one thing that disquieted them was the possibility that if Hasdrubal were defeated, the other Hasdrubal and Mago might withdraw in dismay into the desolate forest and mountains, and so prolong hostilities. They felt the best plan was to split their forces in 2 and carry on simultaneous operations throughout the whole of Spain. They therefore made a division that gave Publius Cornelius Scipio command of 2/3 of the combined Roman and allied troops for operations against Mago and Hasdrubal, while Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio took 1/3 of the original army plus the Celtiberians to engage Hasdrubal Barca. The 2 commanders and their armies set off together, the Celtiberians in front, and they pitched camp at the city of Amtorges, in sight of the enemy, but with a river separating them. There Gnaeus Scipio dug in with the troops mentioned above, while Publius Scipio set off to undertake the share of the campaign that had been assigned to him. 33. Hasdrubal noticed that the Roman force in the camp was small, and that all their hope lay in the Celtiberian auxiliaries. He was thoroughly acquainted with barbarian perfidy, especially that of all the tribes amongst whom he had been campaigning over the years, and communicating with them by language was easy, since both camps were full of Spaniards. He accordingly held covert meetings with the Celtiberian chieftains, and for a large sum of money got them to agree to remove their troops from the area. This did not strike the Celtiberians as a serious transgression on their part. It was not a question of turning their weapons on the Romans, and they were being given remuneration large enough for fighting a war, for not fighting one. Then there was the repose itself, the return to their homes, the pleasure of seeing their own people and their own possessions. All this was very appealing to the common soldier. As a result, the rank and file were as easily persuaded as their leaders, and at the same time there was not even any fear of the Romans, given their small numbers, forcibly holding them back. Roman commanders will always have to be circumspect in this regard, and instances of this kind should truly be taken as object lessons. They must not put such reliance on foreign auxiliaries as to fail to keep Roman strength and Roman forces predominant in their camp. The Celtiberians abruptly pulled up their standards and left. When the Romans asked why they were going and pleaded with them to stay, their only reply was that they were called away by war at home. When his allies could be detained neither by entreaty nor by force, and when he saw that he was no match for the enemy without them, that joining up with his brother again was impossible, and that there was no other safe course of action available, Scipio decided to withdraw as far as he could. His one concern in doing so was to avoid engaging the enemy on level ground at any point, and the enemy had now crossed the river and was hard on the heels of the retreating Romans. 34. During this same period, Publius Scipio was prey to a fear equally great, and faced a danger that was even greater from a new enemy. This was the young Massinissa, at that time an ally of the Carthaginians, but whose fame and power came later from his friendship with Rome. Now, Massinissa and his Numidian cavalry confronted Publius Scipio while he was on the move, and then kept constant pressure on him day and night. Not only would he capture Romans who wandered too far from camp to gather wood and fodder, but he would ride right up to the camp, and often charging into the midst of the sentry post, he would cause terrible confusion everywhere. During the nights, too, there was often panic at the gates and on the rampart from his surprise attacks. There was no time and no place that the Romans could be free from fear and worry, and they were pinned down within their fortifications, deprived of access to all essentials. They were now virtually under siege, and one that threatened to become even tighter if Indibulus, who was rumored to be approaching with 7,500 Suestani, joined up with the Carthaginians. Scipio was a careful and prudent leader, but his dire situation obliged him to adopt an audacious plan. He would proceed at night to meet Indibulus and engage him wherever he found him, leaving a small contingent of men in camp under his legate, Tiberius Fontius. Scipio set off in the middle of the night and engaged the enemy when he encountered him. It was a fight between marching columns rather than battle lines. But the Romans had the upper hand as far as he could be told from such a scrappy encounter. But suddenly the Numidian cavalry, whom the Roman commander thought he had evaded, surrounded their flanks and struck great panic into them. In addition, after beginning their new flight with the Numidians, the Romans were confronted by a third enemy, the Carthaginian generals, who came up upon them from behind when they were already engaged. The battle was now on two fronts for the Romans, who did not know against which enemy or in which direction they should close ranks and charge. As their commander fought, gave encouragement, and placed himself where the pressure was greatest, his right side was run through by a lance. A group of the enemy had formed a wedge and attacked the men standing close to the commander. And these now saw Scipio slipping lifeless from his horse. Wild with joy, they ran the length of the battle line, shouting out the news that the Roman commander had fallen. The report spread far and wide, making it clear that the enemy were victorious and the Romans beaten. The commander lost flight from the field. The commander lost. Flight from the field began immediately. Breaking through the Numidians and the other light-armed auxiliaries did not prove difficult, but they could hardly make good their escape from the large numbers of cavalry and of infantrymen who were fast enough to keep pace with the horses. There were almost more cut down in the flight than in the fighting, and none would have survived but for the arrival of darkness, the day by now coming quickly to a close. 35. The Carthaginian generals were not slow in exploiting their success. Barely allowing their soldiers their much-needed rest, they hastily marched their column to Hasdrubal, son of Hamilcar, immediately after the battle, quite confident that the war could be wound up if they joined up with him. When they arrived, exuberant congratulations were exchanged between the armies, and their generals elated as they were with their recent victory. A great commander and his entire army had been wiped out, and they took it to be a certainty that another such victory lay ahead. Word of the crushing defeat had not yet reached the Romans, but there was a dismal silence, and the silent foreboding usually present in men's minds when they had a premonition of imminent disaster. The general himself realized that he had been abandoned by his allies, and that the enemy's forces had been enormously increased, and, in addition, deduction and reason led him to suspect that a defeat had been sustained rather than to entertain any sanguine hopes. For he asked himself, how could Hasdrubal and Mago have brought their army to the spot without a fight, unless they had first wrapped up their own military operations? Or how could his brother not taken a stand against them, or dogged their footsteps? That would at least have enabled him to join forces with his brother, if he could not prevent the enemy armies and generals from joining up. Tormented by such disturbing questions, Scipio believed the one safe course for the moment was to retreat as far as he could, and in a single night, with the enemy unaware of his departure, and accordingly take no action. He covered a considerable amount of ground. At dawn, the enemy realized the Romans had gone, and sending the Numidians ahead, they set off in pursuit with all the speed they could muster. The Numidians caught up with them before nightfall, and by directing attacks on their rear as well as their flanks, they forced them to halt and defend the column. Scipio, however, repeatedly encouraged the men to fight and keep advancing as far as they could in safety before the enemy infantry overtook them. 36. For quite some time, because Scipio kept driving on and then halting the column, little headway was made, and now night was coming on. Scipio therefore called his men back from the fight, gathered them in a body, and led them up a hillock, which, while not affording much security, especially for demoralized troops, was nevertheless higher than all the surrounding terrain. Here baggage and cavalry were placed in the center, and the infantry posted around them initially had no difficulty in fighting off the attacks of the Numidians. Then the three generals came on the scene with their entire column, comprising three armies with their full complement of troops, and it became clear that the Romans would not have the strength to defend the position just with their weapons, and without some means of fortification. Their commander then began to look around and consider if there were some possible means of throwing a palisade around the spot. But the hillock was so bare and composed of such stony soil that there was no brushwood to be found for cutting stakes, and no earth either that would enable them to make a rampart of turf, dig a ditch, or construct any other defensive structure. And yet no part of the hill was high or steep enough to make it difficult for the enemy to advance or climb up to them. Everywhere the ground sloped gently, but to put in the enemy's path something that looked like a palisade, they began to encircle themselves with pack saddles, with the loads still attached, building them up like a wall to the usual height of a defense work. When they ran out of pack saddles, or the barricade, they tossed baggage of all kinds on top. When the Carthaginians' armies arrived, they marched the column up the hillock very easily. Then the novel appearance of the barrier, a remarkable sight, stopped them in their tracks, and shouts from their officers started to go up on every side. Why were they stopped, they asked, and why were they not tearing down and ripping apart this ludicrous object that was barely strong enough to hold back women and children? The enemy was captured and in their hands, lurking behind their baggage. Such were contemptuous reproaches of the officers, but jumping over or cleaning away the piles of baggage in their path was no easy matter, nor was cutting a path through the massed pack saddles buried beneath them. But once they had removed this barrier of packs by means of poles, thus affording the soldiers passage, and this was done at several points, the camp was stormed from every side. The Romans were cut down everywhere. They were few, the enemy many. They were demoralized, and the enemy triumphant. Even so, a large number of men managed to flee to the nearby woods and then make good their escape to the camp of Publius Scipio, which was now under the command of Scipio's lieutenant Tiberius Fonteius. Some authorities have it that Gnaeus Scipio was killed on the hillock in the initial charge of the enemy. Others claim that he slipped away with a few men to a tower near the camp. According to this version, a fire was lit around the tower, and it was captured after the door was burned down, the enemy having been completely unable to force it open. All inside were then killed, including the general himself. Gnaeus Scipio was killed in the 8th year after his arrival in Spain, and on the 29th day after his brother's death. Sorrow over the deaths of the men was not more intense in Rome than it was throughout Spain. Indeed, the grief of the citizens of Rome was partly over the destruction of the armies, the loss of a province, and a national catastrophe, whereas in Spain it was the loss of generals themselves that people felt and regretted, and the more so in the case of Gnaeus. For he had been commander for a longer period, had won their esteem earlier than his brother, and, in addition, he had been for them the first example of Roman justice and moderation. 37. It seemed that the armies had been destroyed and Spain had been lost. when a single individual remedied that desperate situation. There was in Gnaeus' army a Roman knight, Lucius Marcius, the son of Septimus Marcius. He was a dynamic young man whose courage and intelligence were considerably greater than one might expect from the station in which he was born. To complement his natural qualities, he had also had the advantage of Gnaeus Scipio's training, which had, over the course of many years, given him a thorough education in the whole range of military science. This man brought the soldiers together after their flight, and he also withdrew a number from the town garrisons. Out of these he had created an army that was by no means contemptible, and he had joined forces with Tiberius Fonteius, Publius Scipio's lieutenant. The Roman knight, however, stood out for the authority and respect he enjoyed amongst the men. This was made clear when, after a fortified camp was built north of the Ebro, the decision was taken for the commander of the army to be elected by the vote of the common soldiers. The men then stood in for each other in guard duty on the rampart and at the sentry post until everyone's vote was cast, and with complete unanimity they conferred supreme command on Lucius Marcius. The time following that, and it was short, Marcius devoted entirely to fortifying the camp and amassing supplies, and the men followed all his orders energetically and in addition with no hint of discouragement. But then word came that Hasdrubal, son of Gisgo, was coming to finish off what remained of war, and he had crossed the Ebro and was closing in on them, and the men also saw the signal for battle that had been built up by their new commander. At that point, they recalled the commanders they had recently had, and the officers and troops they had come to rely on when they went into battle. They all suddenly burst into tears and beat their heads, some of them raising their hands to heaven to reproach the gods, others lying on the ground and calling upon their former commander by name. Quelling and weeping and wailing was impossible, for all the centurion's efforts to restore the morale of men in their companies, and Marcius's own attempts to calm or chasten them. He scolded them for abandoning themselves to useless tears like women, rather than summoning up the courage to defend themselves and their state along with them, and he asked them not to let their commanders lie unavenged in their graves. Then suddenly shouts were heard, and the blare of trumpets, for the enemy were already close to their defense works. With that, distress suddenly turned to anger, and the men rushed to arms. They seemed to burn with fury as they converged swiftly on the gates and flew at the enemy who were advancing towards them in careless disorder. The unexpected occurrence immediately unnerved the Carthaginians. Where, they wondered, could so many enemy soldiers have sprung from, when their army had been practically wiped out? Where had men who were defeated and routed found such spirit and such self-confidence? Who had emerged as commander after the two Scipios were killed? Who was in command of the camp, and who had given the signal for battle? Faiths with so much that they had not expected, they first gave ground, totally baffled and bewildered. Then, pushing back by a determined assault, they turned and ran. There would now have followed either horrific slaughter of the fleeing enemy or an incautious and perilous charge by the pursuers, had not Marcius swiftly signaled recall. Standing before his men at the foremost standards and grabbing some with his own hands, he checked the overexcited troops. He then led them back to camp, still craving slaughter and bloodshed. As for the Carthaginians, after being initially driven in chaos from the enemy rampart, they saw nobody in pursuit, and they returned to camp nonchalantly, and at a leisurely pace, thinking their enemy had stopped from fear. There was the same insouciance with regard to the camp's security. Although the enemy was close at hand, they reflected that they were merely the remnants of the two armies that had been destroyed a few days earlier. As a result, there was neglect of everything on the side of the enemy, and when he had established this, Marcius turned his thoughts to a plan that was at first sight foolhardy rather than simply daring. He would make a preemptive attack on the enemy camp, for he thought that storming the camp of a single Hasdrubal would be easier than defending his own would be if the three armies and the three generals linked up again. At the same time, he reflected that if his endeavor were successful, he would restore the battered Roman fortunes, and if he were defeated, he would, at least, by taking the offensive, put an end to the enemy's disdain for him. 38. But such an impetuous deed the panic darkness can cause, and a plan seemingly at odds with his present circumstances could alarm the men, and to prevent that he felt he should address them with some words of encouragement. He therefore called a meeting and spoke as follows. Men, my respect for our commanders, living and dead, combined with the circumstances in which we all now find ourselves, could make anyone see that this command of mine, though a distinction conferred at your discretion, is really a heavy and worrisome burden. Were fear not deadening my distress, I should scarcely now have the composure to find any solace for my grief-stricken heart, and this is the very time when I must do what is the most difficult thing in times of sorrow, to make plans alone on behalf of you all. And yet, at a time when I am obliged to think of some way to protecting for our fatherland these remnants of two armies, I cannot take my thoughts away from my constant sorrow. For that bitter memory is ever there, and the two Scipios are on my mind day and night, bringing me worry and sleeplessness. They often wake me from sleep, telling me not to let them remain unavenged, not themselves, not their soldiers, your comrades, who for 8 years were unconquered in these lands, and not the Republic. And they bid me follow their training and principles, and just as no one was more obedient to their commands while they lived than I was, now after their deaths, they order to me to accept as the best course of action in any situation the one I think they would have followed. In your case, too, men, I would not have you show your respect for them with lamentation and tears as though they were dead. They live on and flourish thanks to their glorious achievements. No, whenever you call them to mind, I want you to go into battle, just as if you can see them encouraging you and giving you the signal. That was certainly the sight that came to your eyes and hearts yesterday. That and no other brought off that remarkable battle. A battle with which you proved to the enemy that the Roman name did not die with the Scipios, and that a people whose might and valor were not buried at Cannae would surely rise above every cruel stroke of fortune. Because you, of your own accord, showed such remarkable grit, I would now like to see how much you would show when your commander asks for it. Yesterday I gave you the signal for retreat when you were engaged in a disordered pursuit of a routed enemy. My wish was not to curb your valor, only to hold it in reserve for greater glory, and for a greater occasion when you might, given the chance, make an attack as a well-prepared force on an enemy of guard, and as armed men on men unarmed, or even asleep. And the hope of such an opportunity is not one I have idly or fancifully conceived, but it is in accord with the facts. Suppose someone were to ask you, in fact, how you managed to protect your camp when you were but a few and the enemy many, then you had been conquered and they were the conquerors. Your reply would be only that it was from fear of that very imbalance, and you fortified all sectors with defense works and kept yourselves on guard and at the ready. That is how things go, in fact. Men are least safe in the face of what fortune leads them not to fear, for one does not guard or protect oneself against what one does not care about. At the moment, there is nothing in the world that the enemy fears less than our attacking their camp. Not when we were just now under pressure and being attacked ourselves. Let us dare a deed of incredible daring. It will be easier for the very reason that it seems too difficult. At the third watch of the night, I shall lead you out in silence. I have intelligence to the effect that the enemy has no regular shifts of guards, no regular sentry post. Our shout at the gates and our first attack will suffice to take the camp. Then, amongst men, drowsy with sleep, disoriented by the sudden uproar, and caught unarmed in their beds, that is the time for that massacre from which, much to your annoyance, you were held back yesterday. I know it seems a reckless plan, but when the situation is dire and hopes are dim, the boldest moves are the safest. An opportunity is soon gone. Hesitate a little at the instant when it is offered, and you can look for it in vain later, for you have missed it. One army is in the vicinity, two others not far away. Attack now, and we will have some chance, and you have already put your might and theirs to the test. If we put matters off, and if, when word spreads of yesterday's counterattack, we cease to be an object of disdain, there is a danger of all their commanders and all their armies linking up. Will we then be able to cope with 3 commanders of the enemy and 3 armies, which Gnaeus Scipio failed to cope with when his army was intact? It was through splitting up their troops that our own commanders perished, and the enemy likewise can be crushed one by one while they are divided. There is no other way to fight the war, so let us wait only for the opportunity the ongoing night will give us. Go now with the gods' favor, and take your food and rest so that you can, fresh and strong, burst into the enemy camp with the same spirit with which you defended your own. The men were overjoyed to hear this new plan from their new leader, and its daring made them like it all the more. The rest of the day was spent seeing to their weapons and preparing themselves physically, and most of the night was given over to sleep. At the 4th watch, they moved out. "39. Beyond the closest camp and separated from it by 6 miles was another division of Carthaginian troops. Between the two lay a sunken hollow that was thick with trees. Somewhere towards the middle of the wood, a company of Roman infantry and some cavalry were set in hiding, the usual Carthaginian trick. The path between the two forces was thus cut off at the midway point, and the rest of the Roman troops were marched silently to the enemy closest to them. There, since there was no sentry post before the gates and no guards on the rampart, they met no resistance, and they marched into the camp as if it were their own. It was then that the trumpets blared and the battle cry went up. Some proceeded to massacre an enemy half asleep. Others hurled blazing torches on the huts, which were thatched with dry straw. Yet others seized the gates to cut off any escape. The fire, shouting and killing all together, gave the enemy, who were in a daze, no chance to hear anything or take any preventive measures. Unarmed, they wandered amongst groups of armed soldiers. Some ran to the gates, others leaped over the rampart when they found the roadways blocked, and as they all got out, they ran immediately towards the other camp, only to be cut off by the Roman infantry company and cavalry that charged from their hiding place, killing every last one of them. In fact, even if anyone had managed to escape from the carnage, so speedily was the Roman dash from the captured near camp to the other that no one could have reached there before them to report the debacle. At the camp, in fact, thanks to its greater distance from the enemy, and the fact that a number of men had slipped away before dawn to gather fodder, firewood, and plunder, the Romans found everything in a state of even greater neglect and disarray. In the sentry post there were only weapons that had been laid aside, and unarmed men were either sitting or lying around or walking about before the rampart and the gates. Such were the men, carefree and relaxed, with whom the Romans, still fired up from their recent engagement and flushed with victory, now went into battle. Stopping them at the gates was absolutely impossible. Within the gates there was a rush from all quarters of the camp, when the shouting and uproar started, and a bloody battle ensued. This would have lasted a long time, but for the sight of the blood on the Roman shields, which gave the Carthaginians a clue that there had been another defeat, and that filled them with alarm. The terror turned them all to flight. They poured out, at least those not victims of the slaughter, wherever there was an exit, and lost the camp. So in a night and day, 2 enemy camps were attacked, under the leadership of Lucius Marcius. Claudius, who translated the annals as Acilius into Latin from the Greek, puts the number of enemy dead at about 37,000, with some 1,830 taken prisoner, and massive amounts of plunder also won. The plunder, Claudius claims, included a 137-pound silver shield bearing a portrait of Hasdrubal Barca. In Valerius Antius' account, only 1 camp was taken, that of Mago, and 7,000 of the enemy were killed. But there was, he says, a second engagement with Hasdrubal, who counterattacked from his camp, in which 10,000 were killed and 4,330 taken prisoner. Piso records that 5,000 were killed in an ambush when Mago was in a disordered pursuit of our retreating soldiers. In all the accounts, Marcius, the commander, is well celebrated, and to the praises that genuinely belong to him, people also add the supernatural, saying that as he was making an address, a flame arose from his head, without his realizing it, to the great consternation of his men who stood around him. They also say that to commemorate his victory over the Carthaginians, a shield bearing the portrait of Hasdrubal, and called the Shield of Marcius, hung in the Capitoline temple right down to the time when the temple burned down. There followed a period of inactivity in Spain, after receiving and inflicting in turn such monumental defeats. Both sides were loath to take a risk on a decisive engagement. 40. Such were the events in Spain. Marcellus, meanwhile, had been so scrupulous and honest in all his dealings in Sicily, following the capture of Syracuse, as to increase not only his own reputation, but the majesty of the Roman people as well. The artwork of the city, however, the sculptures and paintings with which Syracuse was richly endowed, he shipped off to Rome. True, they were enemy spoils, won under the rules of warfare, but this was what first started the appreciation for Greek works of art, and the license we now see in the widespread looting of all manner of things, sacred and profane. This eventually recoiled on the Roman gods and did so first of all on the very temple that was superbly furbished by Marcellus. Temples dedicated by Marcellus close to the Porta Capena, used to be visited by foreigners because of their outstanding artworks of this kind. But only a tiny fraction of these works now remain. See that? Even back then. Deputations were now coming to Marcellus from almost all the communities of Sicily, and the treatment they received differed according to the case they made. Those that had not defected, or which had re-established their alliance before Syracuse was taken, were regarded and treated as faithful allies. Those whom fear had forced to capitulate after the capture of Syracuse were given terms as a vanquished people by the victor. The Romans, however, still had a considerable amount of residual fighting around Agrigentum. Epicides and Hanno, commanders of the earlier war, were still active, and there was a new man, sent out by Hannibal to replace Hippocrates. He was from Hippacra and of Libo-Phoenician nationality, called Mutinus by his own people. He was an enterprising individual who had gained a thorough mastery of the arts of war under Hannibal's instruction. This Mutinus was given some Numidian auxiliaries by Epicides and Hanno, and with them he made a broad sweep of enemy territory, and kept Carthaginian allies loyal by bringing all of them timely assistance. So successful was he in this, that he soon made a name for himself throughout Sicily, and he represented the greatest hope for those espousing the Carthaginian cause. The two other commanders, the Carthaginian and the Syracusan, had until then been pinned down within the fortifications of Agrigentum, but on Mutinus' advice, and more because of their confidence in him, they now ventured forth beyond the walls to encamp at the river Himera. When this was reported to Marcellus, he immediately moved his troops forward and took up a position about 4 miles from the enemy, intending to wait and see what they were doing or preparing to do. Mutinus, however, gave him no room to move and no time to pause or plan. He crossed the river and attacked his enemy's outpost, causing enormous fright and consternation. The following day, he engaged in what was almost a regular battle and drove the Romans back inside their fortifications. But he was then called away from the front by a mutiny of the Numidians in the camp. Some 300 of them had withdrawn to Heraclea, Minoa. He set off to calm these men down and bring them back to service, and it is said that as he left, he gave the commanders an emphatic warning not to engage the enemy in his absence. This angered the two commanders, Hanno more than his colleagues, because he had already been troubled over Mutinus' celebrity. He resented the fact that Mutinus should be setting limits on his actions, a low-born African limiting a Carthaginian general on assignment from his senate and people. Hanno then convinced the wavering Epicides that they should cross the river and offer battle. If they waited for Mutinus, he explained, and the battle turned out successfully, there was no doubt that the glory would go to Mutinus. 41. Now Marcellus felt it would be humiliating for him, the man who had driven Hannibal from Nola, when the Carthaginian was still elated with the victory at Cannae, to give way before this enemy that he had already defeated on land and sea. He therefore issued orders for his men to take up their weapons immediately, and for the standards to be carried out. He was deploying his troops when 10 Numidians broke away from the enemy line and came galloping up. They reported to him that their compatriots would not take part in the battle. First, they said, they sympathized with the mutiny involving the 300 of their number who had withdrawn to Heraclea, but then they were also concerned that their own officer had been removed just before the battle by generals trying to belittle his reputation. A duplicitous people, the Numidians were nevertheless true to their word. As a result, when word passed swiftly through the ranks that the enemy had been abandoned by his cavalry, which the Romans had feared most, Roman morale rose. In addition, the enemy were terrified. Apart from losing the support of the strongest section of their forces, they were also filled with fear that they might be attacked by their own cavalry. And so it was not much of a fight, and the first battle cry and the first onslaught decided the outcome. The Numidians stood inactive on the wings during the encounter, and when they saw their side turn to run, they briefly joined them in their flight. Then they saw that they were all heading in panic for Agrigentum, and, fearing to be under siege there, they slipped away in all directions to the nearest communities. Many thousands of men were killed and 6,000 were captured along with 8 elephants. This was Marcellus's final battle in Sicily, and after it he returned triumphant to Syracuse. The year was now practically at an end, and so in Rome the Senate passed a decree instructing the praetor Publius Cornelius to write to the consuls in Capua to inform them that while Hannibal was far off and nothing of any significance was going on around Capua, one of the consuls, if he saw fit, should come to Rome to supervise the election of the next magistrates. On receiving the dispatch, the consuls agreed between them that Claudius should conduct the elections and Fulvius remain at Capua. The consuls elected under Claudius's supervision were Gnaeus Fulvius Centumulus and Publius Sulpicius Galba, son of Servius Galba. Sulpicius had held no prior curule office. The praetors elected after that were Lucius Cornelius Lentulus, Marcus Cornelius Cethegus, Gaius Sulpicius, and Gaius Calpurnius Piso. City jurisdiction was allotted to Piso, Sicily to Sulpicius, Apulia to Cethegus, and Sardinia to Lentulus. The consuls saw their imperium extended for a year. End of Book 25.